Welcome to the Redeemer Church podcast, where we share weekly sermons from our Sunday gatherings at Redeemer Church in Charlotte, North Carolina. Let's listen now.
Good morning. Today we have the very sobering passage of Jesus before Pilate, his trial before the crucifixion. So give your full attention. Thank you so much. From Luke 23. Then the whole company of them arose and brought him before Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." And Pilate asked him, Are you the king of the Jews? And he answered him, "You have said so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowd, "I find no guilt in this man." But they were urgent, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee even to this place." When Pilate heard this, he asked, Is the man a Galilean? And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him over to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad because he had long desired to see him. He had heard about him. He was hoping to see some sign done by him. So he questioned him at some length, but Jesus made no answer. The chief priests and scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. And Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. And arraying him in splendid clothing, they sent him back to Pilate. Herod and Pilate became friends from that very day. For before this, they had been at enmity with each other. Pilate then called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was misleading the people, and after examining him, behold, I don't find this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither did Herod, for he sent him back to us. So nothing deserving death has been done by him. I will therefore punish and release him." But they cried out together, "Away with this man. Release to us Barabbas." A man who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection started in the city and for murder. Pilate addressed them once more, desiring to release Jesus, but they kept shouting, "Crucify, crucify him." A third time he said to them, "But what evil has he done? I have found in him no guilt deserving death, so I will punish him and release him." But they were urgent, demanding with loud cries that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate decided their demand should be granted. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, for whom they asked, but he delivered Jesus over to their will. This is the word of the Lord.
Good morning, everyone. A few months ago, I got a text from Leah, and she asked me, "Do you want Tara's mom's sweater?" And I said, "This feels like a trap. But if I did want Tara's mom's sweater, how would I inquire about this?" Long story short, it's actually Tara's dad's sweater, is what it is. Father-in-law. I've butchered this story on multiple fronts. I'm sorry. If you'd like to know about the rest of my outfit, you can ask Lem. Maybe he would have the details. Thank you. We will do what we always do now here and pause, be silent, take a break, and pray. Hear this from 2 Corinthians. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Gracious God, thank you for this passage from Paul and for the one that Allison just read, for this story of you doing something incredible and shocking and taking the place of guilty human beings. Would you give us ears that can hear and hearts that are willing to listen? Amen. Franklin, can you put up that picture of that random dude? Thank you. This is not so much a random dude, but Robert H. Jackson, who served as an associate justice on the United States Supreme Court for over a decade. He entered the Supreme Court in 1941, which was a big time in world history. And he was formerly the U.S. Attorney General. He would go on to be part of several truly massive court cases. He gave one of the dissenting opinions in the Korematsu versus the United States case. And this, of course, was the case that upheld the removal of Japanese Americans, many who were born in the United States, the removal from the West Coast in military areas. And this decision is largely seen as what led to the relocation and internment of some 120,000 people of Japanese origin. Besides giving a dissenting opinion on that one, he also sat on Brown versus the Board of Education, though he passed away before the final decision was made, where segregation in schools was struck down. But perhaps what he is most known for, is this picture right here, is his participation and specifically his opening remarks at the first Nuremberg trials. This was just at the beginning of the aftermath of World War II and the Holocaust, and the world was just starting to piece together what had just happened. Jackson stood in front of a court of that would assess 24 major Nazi leaders. And he said this: "The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored, because it cannot survive their being repeated." He would continue on to talk about how these four nations represented in overseeing the courts for the Nazis leaders, we're seeking justice, not vengeance, and that this was the greatest form of power, is to seek justice instead of vengeance. The grave responsibility of justice is one of those phrases that pops out. It's all over the history books now. But listen, by this point, Hitler was dead. The concentration camps through Germany and Nazi-occupied Europe had seen their liberation days. But it would be comical and offensive for me to suggest that the world should just move on now after this, should just get over it. Liberation and defeat of evil had come, but this wasn't enough. The unimaginable horrors of World War II and the Holocaust could not be ignored. Though the primary reason, like Jackson said, shouldn't just be that it won't be repeated. Because when something is so wrong, so dark, so evil, when something that evil has happened, there is a grave responsibility for justice. And what we will find is that the effects of sin have been so devastating on humanity in this instance and many others that it cannot be ignored. So in this series, I don't know what week we're in, 6, 7, you tell me. But we have been looking at the different angles of the crucifixion and Jesus' death, God's death on the cross as an answer to the problem of sin in the world. So today we're going to keep talking about that, and we're going to hone in on this trial that Jesus is in. And every trial that sees its way through has a verdict and then an aftermath. And so we'll begin here at the beginning of Luke. Jesus was arrested by the Jews. We saw this in the garden last week. And now, to make it official, they're brought to the Romans. The Jews didn't have this power to actually incarcerate Jesus long term, but the Romans did, so let's get them on our side. And every trial requires an accusation. This is in verses 1 and 2. Then the whole assembly rose and led him off to Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payments of taxes to Caesar and claims to be Messiah, a king." This phrase, "we have found him to be misleading our nation," this was, or later on, they say that he stirs up people. That's in verse 5. He claims to be king. This stirring up, this leading the people astray, this was a formal allegation by Jesus, or about Jesus. And it was, in the Jewish people's eyes, that he was a false prophet, though what Pilate would have heard as leading people astray is most likely a rebellion or civil unrest, something to that effect, almost an insurrection. And this isn't just a trivial dispute, if you will, but it's legally the trial must proceed. Now it has been brought up the ranks. It's not just kind of a civil disagreement, but there has to be a trial. And zooming out, this is the climax of the ongoing clash between Jesus and the religious leaders. It reflects this grander, big, almost cosmic difference between Jesus and the religious leaders. Jesus came claiming to bring order, peace, light to a world that had disorder, chaos, darkness. He often addressed the idea of sin, its power, its tentacles, and accused the religious leaders, the Jewish religious leaders, as embodying that sin. But the leaders didn't see it that way, did they? They saw Jesus as offensive, rebellious, irreverent. They don't just merely disagree with him and his mission, but they view him as adding to the darkness, adding to the sin. This is not just a charge against Jesus, but it's a clash between two realities. In hindsight, for us, clarifies which side we want to be on. But for participants in the story, that may not have been so clear. Israel is at a point where they have to decide what will happen next. In the late summer of 1920, in America, the 19th Amendment was adopted, and this was that there could not be a prohibition on voting on the basis of sex. Essentially, what this means is that women have the ability to vote in America. However, enforcement, like many of these amendments in court cases, enforcement required more legal action. In Baltimore, there were these two women named Mary D. Randolph and Cecilia Street Waters. Both of them had applied and were actually registered to vote. But Oscar Lesser, who seems like a real winner of a guy, he sued to block them from being able to vote. The Maryland Constitution at that point in time limited suffrage to men, and this created the trial of Lesser versus Garnett. The courts had to decide between two realities: women's rights to vote or states' restrictions. Which reality are we playing into? Which reality will we live in? So the Supreme Court settled on the matter, and the rest is history. Similarly, with sin, darkness, brokenness, Jesus declared, he came into the world and declared, enough is enough. I'm doing something about this. I'm doing a new thing about this. And the Jewish leaders resisted it, insisting that you're not the one to do this for us. You are not the deliverer that we've been waiting for. These two realities collide. Rowan Williams, talking about sin, said, "Sin, it isn't high drama defiance. It's just being seriously wrong about reality and living against the grain. The committed sinner is like someone convinced you can make trains run on black coffee. determined to try despite the evidence. Later, he calls this the world's preference for unreality. The leaders, the Jewish leaders, embrace this reality. This is the reality that they were taught and that they have now perpetuated from when they were little boys to now the men leading the religious nature of the country. Sin is the unrelenting preference for unreality. And it meets ultimate reality, that is God himself, who refuses to let sin rule, who does not like unreality. No wonder things have reached a head. Israel is at an inflection point. Jesus came to disrupt the rhythms, traditions, and even comfort of the religious leaders. This trial is inevitable. And this story here reflects a very ancient way of talking about sin and responsibility for it. All over the Bible, there's talk about making amends, about recompense, the weighing of scales, payment, justice, injustice, and all the consequences that flow downstream. Sin can be framed as a dark power, a corrupting force, but here it is pitched in a legal or judicial sense. Early Christian writers treated sin in this way. Old Testament authors, New Testament authors, particularly Paul, we'll see, is that he mentions the record of debt, the wages of sin. Later authors in the first few centuries talked about the accused being vindicated and the accusers, or the accuser, Satan, being silenced, all with God being the judge proceeding over this trial, as it were. In the Middle Ages, it goes a little bit more quiet on the judicial nature, but you do have several voices, Anselm included, who emphasize God's honor. When God sees sin, does he do something about it? And Anselm says, yes, because of God's honor, an appeal to God's honor, that God cannot just let sin go unpunished or undealt with. Sin has repercussions, like a crime invoking a sentence. Famously, during the Reformation, this courtroom metaphor explodes everywhere. The divine trial involving humanity, God, and the devil, with the jury still out on who's responsible for sin. Then you get to the 20th century, and there's 2 world wars. There's unimaginable genocides, and the fear of total human annihilation. The nuclear bomb can eliminate all of Earth for the first time in human history. And a lot of authors, writers, religious or non-religious figures, seem to put God on trial, wondering what God is doing about this. All of these were meant to take sin into account and meant to figure out who is responsible and to what extent they're culpable for sin. And while most of this seems very obvious to us religious folk who are steeped in church life, the court of public opinion must go on. The trial of Jesus similarly must go on. Verse 3. So Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you king of the Jews?" Jesus, this is his only 4 words in this portion of Luke. He says, "You have said so." Then Pilate announced to the chief priests and the crowd, "I have no basis for a charge against this man." It seems like a quick open and shut case. But Luke notes several times in these 25 verses that the leaders insisted. They were persistent on bringing charges forth on Jesus. And there's these several verses of interaction between Jesus, the crowd, the Pilate, and then Herod. The claim that he stirs up crowds from Jerusalem, or from Galilee to Jerusalem. This is what the crowd said. And then Pilate says, "Galilee, you say? Send him to Herod. That's his deal. That's his jurisdiction." So then Herod questions Jesus, and Jesus gave no answer, is what Luke says. And the leaders, Allison punctuated this word with her voice. She said, vehemently accused him, and the Romans mocked him. Herod returns to Jesus to Pilate, and then this happens in verse 13. Pilate called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who is inciting the people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence and have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us, as you can see. He has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore, I will punish him and then release him." Both of these Roman officials, neutral in theory, find Jesus not guilty. The Jewish leaders continue to insist, this is theme, they insist that he incites rebellion, and they're saying, hey, you should be worried about this guy. And the Roman rulers are like, we're not worried about this guy. They say, no, he's innocent. And then Luke emphasizes this, just Pilate truly believes that Jesus is innocent despite having no personal stake in the game. And what Jesus does with these claims, these accusations, is he stays silent. We have those 4 words from verse 3, you have said so, about being king. But otherwise, this is the choice not to speak. And at this point, it's not just a virtuous choice, it's not just like a good godly thing that Jesus is doing, but it signals what's coming. And that's that Jesus fully plans to die. By the passage's end, there's this very sobering phrase that Jesus was surrendered over to their will. An angry mob of people who really want to kill somebody, and he's surrendered over to their will. While the story indicates that Pilate was finally annoyed enough by the Jewish leaders to let them get away with it and let them have Jesus, this was Jesus' choice. He's been moving towards this all along. This is not Pilate or Herod, the disciples, the crowds taking Jesus and forcing him to do something, but this is God yielding himself willingly. The irony here, of course, is that the one on trial is the one who it has been said about, holy, 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 there is no one like you. This is the same God that Moses could not get close to and had to take his shoes off near. The one that Isaiah said about, woe is me, I'm a man of unclean lips. And that Job said, I'm unworthy, how can I reply to you? And this is the same Jesus that Peter said, go away from me, Lord, I'm a sinful man. And who John said he wasn't even worthy to unstrap his sandals. The ultimate irony is that the innocent creator, sustainer of all things, is on trial. And when they cry, crucify him, he does not argue. God being wrongfully accused, facing death, and he allows it. He's taking responsibility for the consequences without actually being guilty. Jesus accepts what's coming, though he caused none of this. This is the God who is said to be the shepherd of Psalm 23, who becomes the sheep or lamb of Isaiah 53, who's led to the slaughter. This is the judge of the whole universe who is now being judged. This theme pops up all over church history. Augustine says this, the judge was judged, the teacher was scourged, the creator was fastened to the cross. Life himself died that he might make the dying live. He died. And by his death, he killed death. Bernard picked up on this and said, the judge was judged and condemned those who he had come to save. Condemned by those who had come to save. Luther picked up on this in the Reformation. He talked about, he who was judged became guilty for us, taking upon himself our sins. Karl Barth is a 20th century theologian, and he wrote massive articles and sections about this idea of the judge being judged. And in one of his sections, he writes this, man's reconciliation with God takes place through God putting himself in man's place and man in God's place as a sheer act of grace. This inconceivable miracle is our reconciliation. And Barth continually emphasizes God's agency in this. This is not just something that happened, it's God's choice from the beginning. In Teach Team this week, Christian kept bringing this up, that this was God's choice from the beginning. It wasn't like Isaac looking at Abraham and was like, hey, where's that lamb? Where's the ram at? This was God's choice from the beginning of time. The shepherd becomes the sheep. The judge is judged. This death, this dealing with sin is what, in place of humanity, is what we call substitution or exchange. And there's a phrase that is passed around all throughout the early church. It's hard to find the origin of it, and it's tinkered with in different ways, but it defines this so well. It says, he became what we are that he might make us what he is. He became what we are that he might make us what he is. Very similar to Paul in 2 Corinthians, which I read earlier. This is the verdict, that God is going to die. He's taking responsibility for the consequences of sin. But with many trials, the aftermath is what endures. Many of us don't remember what happened in a specific case, or we just read these names like, what was that about? But we know the effects of it, if you will. And there's a moment in here that is very scandalous and shocking. You know it already, but this is verse 18. The whole crowd shouted, "Away with this man." And then they randomly brought up this guy. They say, "Release Barabbas to us." And Luke decides to tell us Barabbas had been thrown into prison for an insurrection in the city and for murder. God was heading to the cross. This was his choice. Yet he was placed beside Barabbas, a murderer and a rebel. The crowds demanded that Barabbas would be freed instead of Jesus. This is what being fully given over to sin's unreality looks like. That God is here going to the cross, and they want somebody who has murdered instead. So God does the unthinkable, and he takes responsibility for it on behalf of the crowds, Pilate, Herod, Barabbas, and to the ends of the earth. Since the Garden of Eden, humanity has been looking for a way to handle sin. It's often called the sin problem, or the sin project, if you will. Looking for a way to deal with it, a way out. And at various points in the story, God has intervened in different ways. He sees sin's consequences, human suffering, nations at war, the innocent dying. And he selectively, it would appear to us, intervenes. And we know this grieves him. And then Jesus is born and proclaims good news. He heals. He gains this following, and then he also gains an angry mob seeking his death. I just picture Jesus knowing everything that is happening, being there throughout all of history, seeing history, and like, is now the time? Like, now's not the time. Is it time to enter? Now's not the time. And since here at Redeemer we care deeply about rich art and symbolism, it seems like a great time to bring up a Marvel movie for the second week in a row. There's, in one of the Avengers movies, I don't know, there's a bunch of them. There's a character named Doctor Strange. I think he's a wizard. And he apparently is able to see into the future. And there's these countless realities. You've heard this, like this timeline, that timeline of what may happen. And they're trying to defeat this big bad guy who there's no way to defeat it. And so he sees in the future and he says, out of the billion jillion ways that this could go down, there's only one in which we could actually beat him. And when another character, I won't spoil it for you, recognizes the cost it would cost them for this one reality to happen, Dr. Strange looks over at them, puts up one finger and nods. It's this powerful moment in superhero world. It's the necessary option. This is the only way out. And I think similarly about Jesus, when he's present in all of history, when he's reflecting on what has happened, when it would appear that God has put Band-Aids on the issue in the past, he's looking back and he knows that the only way is to the cross. This is the only path. And he surrendered Jesus' will. He released the man who had been thrown into prison. This is the murderer, the one they asked for, and Jesus was surrendered over to their will. I imagine Jesus looking over at the followers, his friends that he had already talked to this about with them. And he points his finger and he nods and he says, "The Son of Man must suffer and be killed, and on the third day be raised." This is what he said in Luke 9. This is the only way. I would be a bad steward of this passage if I did not bring up Isaiah 53. So here it is. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. We all, like sheep, have gone astray, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Why? God, in all of his infinite wisdom, power, foreknowledge, ability to create the world, why is this the one way? I have some hunches, but I'm not certain. But in that infinite wisdom and power, what is clear is that God saw that the only way was through his suffering and death. That's the only way that humanity could be rescued from sin. The only way that humanity could be rescued from this unreality of sin was that God himself would suffer and die. It's incredible. This is the only way. This is how God stays true to himself and deals with sin. Sin is living in an unreality, often unknowingly. Jesus illustrates this in a few verses later, where he says, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." This is why Jesus is heading to the cross. Sin is deceptive. It creates worlds of untruth, and humanity often uses sin to try to solve the issue of sin. How do we get out of this world that we call, or this sinful world? We sin. And Augustine has an astounding quote on this that maybe can just speak for itself. But he says, "Many sins are committed by people weeping and groaning in their distress. In wishing to be rid of painful things, they destroy the patience by which the path to a better life is kept open." Or as one author said, people who know better and feel trapped. Many sins are committed by people weeping and groaning in their distress. Sin is not just this right or wrong thing, nor just only about guilt, something that requires recompense. But sin itself expresses our deepest longings and pain and suffering. Even in the cries of the crowd to crucify Jesus, there is an expression of the soul's deepest longing for sin to be addressed. Not only its power over us, but the guilt and the shame that it brings. And God, in all of his compassion, sees us as people who sin while weeping and groaning, as people who know better but are trapped. And that's what led him to this exchange. The death of God brings liberation from sin's power over us. But what about the pain that we cause? Sin done to us, but what about sin that we do to others? Joan Chittister distinguishes two types of suffering. She says, the first comes from circumstances beyond our control. When your house burns down, car breaks down, a loved one passes away when they should pass away. This causes us real suffering and pain. The second comes from things that we do to ourselves. These are the sufferings that tear us apart inside. And I think many of us know this second type of suffering. Consider not just the victim, but the victimizer. The person who decides to mug an old lady, or the distracted driver who runs into another car, totals that car and the people that are in it. Or the spouse who had the affair, not the one who had the affair on them. You've seen the person who's on the receiving end of these awful things. We've seen how it breaks down families, children, lives when these things happen to them. But what about those who do them and hate themselves for doing it, that know how awful it is? I don't know if you specifically have sat with somebody who has had an affair, who's cheated on their spouse. And I'm sure there's many that feel little remorse, but the ones that do, the pain, fear, and desperation in their eyes is not something that leaves you quickly. It's very profound. And so this is where Fleming Rutledge comes and says, in the final analysis, the crucifixion of Christ for the sin of the world revealed that it is not only the victims of oppression and injustice who are in need of God's deliverance, but also the victimizers. Each of us is capable, under certain circumstances, of being a victimizer. The cross is profoundly good news for the oppressed and for those who oppressed. The miracle at the center of Jesus' death on the cross is that it brings wholeness, peace, and restoration somehow to both parties, offended and offender alike. Because God knows that both offended and offender are weeping and groaning in the unreality of sin. There seems to be just one thing that keeps us in this unreality, and it's our inability or unwillingness to see that it is an unreality that we live in, to see that sin is a deceptive world and web that oppresses us. Rowan Williams says, because this recognition of sin and being sinners carries with it confidence that there's really a way out. If we know that this is the world that we live in and that we are not just victims of it, but victimizers as well, there is hope for a way out. This is the way out. It's not a get-out-of-jail-free card. It's not being absolved from responsibility or the consequences of sins that we do to others. I would say that much of the Christian life seems to be about actually taking responsibility for our actions and the consequences that come with it. Paul says, by no means keep sinning so that God's grace could abound. But this is a miracle for those who are grieved by who they are. And it begins with recognition. To recognize sin, its nastiness, and our part in it. And to see God's goodness, restoration, wholeness, and love extending to both victim and victimizer, perpetrator and the one being harmed. Because God sees both as weeping and groaning in this unreality. Let's pray. Father, thank you that you see us in the way that you do. Thank you that you see us as people who are part of this sin project but don't want to be. We want a way out, God. Thank you for your kindness to us, to see the pinnacle of this unreality of sin and say that you would take the consequences for it. Would you give us grace now to see a way forward for those of us who are grieved by who they are? Give us a vision of true reality today. Amen.